Something went wrong at 11:47 p.m. Not with a bang, not with an alarm. Just a quiet flicker, a number that shouldn't have moved, moving. Nobody caught it in time. The engineer who first noticed was sitting alone in a monitoring station outside Colorado Springs. 3 screens, cold coffee. 11 years reading orbital telemetry. He knew what normal looked like. And this was not normal. One satellite had drifted, only a fraction of a degree off its expected path. But in the geometry of space, a fraction of a degree is the difference between precision and catastrophe. He flagged it internally, sent a message to his supervisor, then watched as a second satellite did the same thing. By midnight, 7 were drifting. He picked up the phone. What followed over the next 12 hours was not a drill. It was a slow, grinding unraveling, one system at a time, as the infrastructure holding the modern world together began to come apart. The most frightening part, most of the planet had no idea. It was happening. To understand what those 12 hours felt like, you need to understand what satellites actually do. Not in the textbook sense, in the real, invisible, taken for granted sense. Every time you check your phone for directions, a satellite confirms where you are. Every time a cargo ship crosses the Pacific, satellites guide it. Every financial transaction processed between banks on opposite sides of the world, satellites are involved. They are not a luxury, they are infrastructure. The nervous system of civilization. And that night, the nervous system was failing. The cause wasn't immediately clear. A solar flare, maybe. A software glitch cascading through orbital management systems. Someone whispered the word sabotage, though it was quickly pulled from official channels. What the engineers knew was this. The drift was not random. The satellites were moving in a pattern, slow, coordinated, as if being nudged deliberately off course. And every time one was corrected using its onboard thrusters, another shifted somewhere else. It was like trying to flatten a wrinkle in a bedsheet. Press one side down, another fold appears. By 1:30 a.m., GPS accuracy had degraded by 40% across the northern hemisphere. Aircraft using GPS-assisted approaches in low visibility began receiving alerts. Automated shipping containers at major ports stopped routing. In the North Sea, an offshore platform's positioning system threw errors that, if uncorrected, could drifted over a pipeline it was meant to avoid. None of these failures were fatal. Not yet. They were warnings. The people inside the agencies managing satellite constellations, NASA, ESA, private operators, were fully awake. The language on those calls was measured, technical, professional, but beneath it lived something else. A controlled fear that comes not from ignorance, but from understanding, from knowing exactly how bad things could get. At 2:14 a.m., the first satellite went silent. Not drifting, not malfunctioning, silent. Its telemetry signal simply stopped. One moment it was transmitting. The next, nothing. Just an empty frequency where a machine the size of a school bus had been orbiting at 17,000 miles per hour. If you're drawn to stories like this, the ones that live in the space between what we're told and what's actually happening, then you should know that Critical Tomorrow exists for exactly that reason. Not to frighten, to look clearly at the systems we depend on and ask what happens when they fail. Subscribe to Critical Tomorrow if you haven't already. Because what comes next is the part nobody in an official briefing room wanted, said aloud. By 3:00 a.m., 4 satellites had gone dark. 2 more were tumbling, rotating uncontrollably, solar panels no longer facing the sun, batteries draining. A satellite that loses power doesn't just stop working. It becomes debris. A dead object hurtling through an orbital corridor shared by dozens of active satellites, and debris in orbit doesn't stay still. This is where the physics become terrifying. Even a small fragment at orbital velocity carries enough energy to punch through a spacecraft like a bullet through paper. Scientists call the chain reaction a Kessler cascade. One collision creates debris. Debris causes another collision. That collision creates more debris, until an entire orbital band becomes an impassable field of destruction. The nightmare scenario, the one that lives in classified risk assessments the public rarely sees. By 4:30 a.m., the question was no longer whether the failures would stop on their own. The question was how far they would go before anything could slow them down. On the ground, the effects were becoming impossible to ignore. Financial markets in Asia opened erratically. High-frequency trading algorithms that depended on microsecond-accurate GPS time signals produced inconsistent results. Several firms halted automatically, others didn't, and the volatility spread. In parts of rural Canada and northern Europe, cellular networks began dropping. Not everywhere, not completely. But in regions where the backbone depended on satellite relay links, the signal became unstable. Frustrating at first. Then it didn't come back. Emergency services in 3 countries logged unusual call volumes. Not disasters, just confusion. People whose navigation apps had stopped. Farmers whose precision equipment had frozen mid-operation. A hospital in Finland whose satellite-linked imaging system went offline, delaying a scheduled procedure. Small things, manageable things, but add enough together and they stop being small. By 6 a.m., a journalist in Brussels monitoring shortwave radio had picked up fragments of communications between aerospace agencies clearly not meant for public ears. She posted a thread. It spread. Within an hour, satellite failure was trending in 11 countries. The official responses were careful, calibrated, and almost entirely useless. Statements acknowledging anomalies with no specifics. Reassurances about redundancies that comforted only those who didn't understand what the words meant. The silence between the official lines was deafening to anyone fluent in institutional language. What the statements didn't say: that the damage was potentially irreversible in certain orbital bands, that 2 silent satellites had been confirmed deorbiting, falling toward atmospheric entry, that the international coordination mechanism designed to manage this crisis was experiencing its own communication difficulties, partly because its infrastructure was also satellite-dependent. The machinery designed to manage the failure was failing alongside it. By 8 a.m., 300 million people were experiencing degraded GPS. Aviation shifted to a ground-based navigation backup not tested at this scale since the 1990s. Several transatlantic flights were rerouted. 2 cargo vessels in the South China Sea reported complete navigation failure, now operating on dead reckoning, the ancient method of estimating position from last known location and speed. At a hospital in Toronto, an automated pharmaceutical inventory system had stopped updating across 12 facilities. Staff switched to manual counts. In São Paulo, a water treatment facility's remote monitoring system went offline. Operators managed, but they hadn't expected to need manual oversight on a Tuesday morning in the 21st century. That's what this felt like. Not the apocalypse people imagine. Not the sudden dramatic collapse. Something quieter. A world that had been running on invisible rails suddenly aware that those rails could disappear. Somewhere in an ordinary apartment, a woman was trying to reach her daughter in another country. The call wouldn't connect. She tried again and again. She knew nothing about satellites or cascades or silent frequencies. She just knew her daughter wasn't answering. She sat by the window and waited. That is what infrastructure failure looks like from the inside. Not explosions, not darkness, just ordinary things that stop working. Calls that don't connect, maps that go blank. The quiet arrival of uncertainty in places where certainty had always lived. By 11 a.m., 12 hours after that first anomalous drift was flagged, the crisis had stabilized, barely, imperfectly. 7 satellites confirmed lost, 11 more in degraded operation. The cascade slowed, not stopped. Recovery measured not in days but in months, possibly years. The world kept moving. It had to. But it moved differently, with the unspoken awareness that something fundamental had shifted, that a layer of the modern world most people never think about had shown, briefly and terrifyingly, that it was not permanent. The satellites didn't all fall, not that morning, but enough fell to remind us that they could. We build our civilization on systems we never see, on signals we never hear, on infrastructure maintained by people whose names we'll never know. Most of the time, it works. Most of the time, the invisible machinery holds. But there are mornings, rare, clarifying, frightening mornings, when you catch a glimpse of how thin the margin actually is, how much trust we place in complexity we don't fully understand, how quietly catastrophe can begin. Maybe the future doesn't end all at once. Maybe it unravels quietly, signal by signal, one silent satellite at a time. If questions like these stay with you, if you believe that understanding what could go wrong is part of how we survive what might, then stay with us here on Critical Tomorrow. Subscribe if you haven't. Not because the news is always dark, but because the people who understand the edges of the world are the ones most prepared to live in it. We'll be here, watching the frequencies, waiting for the next signal, telling you the truth about what it means.